Thank you. Now, on the meantime, we will be having Teresa Durand Mazza. She is a senior consultant in gender and social inclusion. Online, we have Rogel del Rosal. Here we have two participants to come here on the front. Mayra, Colín, Marín from the Basin and San José Rincón, and Guadalupe Guieshuba Alonso, Buendía, that is the liaison in the Human Rights Department for Water in the Ministry of Water from the State of Mexico. While we accommodate, we would like to thank all the people here and online and the speakers. Thank you very much, Mario, for your participation and moderating the event. I think there are very key points that will be very helpful for the objective of this project, that is to make this legal framework in these issues regarding water and climate change. So, I just would like to mention that as the ambassador was mentioning about the issues on governance, I think they didn't mention it with that word, but it has a lot to do with co-responsibility that the citizenship has for financing and education and the usage and leverage. But I was mentioning the ambassador that people that live in Mexico City, we pay 40 pesos every 2 months for water. I can bring my bill and I can show it to you. When a cup of coffee, I mean, we cannot even, there's not a coffee shop that it's 40 pesos for coffee, just to start seeing the dimension of all the responsibility that we have for paying the fair usage and the leveraging of the water, even though it's a public asset. So I wanted to leave that comment. On the meantime, as well, to adjust time, we want to mention that the exercise of the theory of change, we will do it online. We will have a call with all the expert people that would like to join us. And so we can have respect for the people that are online, that I think they go more often for coffee than us, and the people here in the room. So thank you for that. Thank you, Laura. And I would like to invite everyone, and thank you again. I would like to introduce our moderator. I hope she is already online. Teresa Durand Mazza. She has a professional experience for more than 30 years on social inclusion, organizations of the civil society, private sector companies, and government agencies. She's in season on social development for the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the British government for 10 years before establishing in Chile in 2012 as a professor. She's also an assistant on gender and inclusion, social inclusion for UK in Central and South America. Thank you very much. Tere, I pass the floor to you. Also online, we will have Rogel del Rosal, and here we have Mayra, Colín, and Guadalupe. Thank you very much. Hi, can you hear me? Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here in this panel. It has been a very long day, I suppose, and I hope you can finish your day having all the reflections in terms of improving governance of the water resources and the Mexican basins that have been selected for this project. I just would like to remind you that the panel that we have today, we will work with the following objectives. We will discuss the state of the integration of the needs and interests of the vulnerable groups for water governance in every basin. We will analyze the inclusion of women and other vulnerable groups like young people or indigenous peoples in governance of a basin. And we will try to identify some recommendations that can be possible and reachable for improving and increasing, strengthening, to move forward with an effective participation of the governance of the basins. So I I will start with the people that are on site. I don't know who would like to start. Guadalupe or Mayra. Guadalupe. Okay, I'll introduce you. Yeah. Guadalupe Alonso Buendía. She has a major on law by the Universidad Nacional de Mexico, and she's currently in a process for having a master's on constitutional law by the UNAM. Guadalupe has a wide trajectory on human rights, and particularly in the right for water, and she's in charge within the Ministry of Water in the coordination of gender and water, so it can, in a plane of equality between men and women. And currently, Guadalupe is a researcher of the National Council of Humanities and Technologies in Mexico. The floor is yours, Guadalupe. Hello, good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to share with you this forum talking about such an important issue as it is water. We were talking about the importance of the women in participation with water, of young girls as well, that they are a vulnerable group in society. Women are the ones who manage the responsibility and protection of water. Women are the ones who prepare the food at home. Women are the ones who protect and who take care of the protection of this vital liquid that is so important. So it is quite important that all the governance and all the public policies can be forward and focused on the protection of this vulnerable group. We were also mentioning another different vulnerable group that are the indigenous peoples, because they are the ones who are immediately affected by the lack of water supply, because these are their territories that naturally are immersed in the basins. For example, we had a place in Huixquilucan. Huixquilucan is a significant part of this water forest. Within this water forest, we captivate the higher part and filtrate the highest part of water for Mexico City. So it's quite interesting how women participate actively in its protection. Of 100% of people that we can find in the protection of this part, 100% are women. So it is important to provide a safe space for the expression and association of their ideas, because there really isn't. There are women and people in general that are affected, then that's why they create the Escazú. But I mean, they're pursued, they are pointed out. There was a testimony of a person that was defending the water forest, that was murdered for defending it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Guadalupe. Can you listen to me? Can you hear me? Guadalupe is representing the Minister of Water in the state of Mexico. Mayra Janine Colette Marín. She has a major in engineering and information systems by the Universidad Interamericana para el Desarrollo. Currently, she's the spokesperson of the Council of Basins in San José del Rincón. That is the auxiliary organism for the Council of Basins in the Valley of Mexico. And she's the head of the program for the mitigation of the lack of water in school centers for Basin. Thank you, Mayra, and please, I pass the floor to you. Thank you, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to participate in a forum for listening vulnerable groups, and I would like to thank Pronatura for this invitation to this dialogue. A lot has been mentioned about the subbasins in the system in Guatemala or the Guatemala system itself, but the landscape that we are seeing is viewed from the outside, and we haven't seen an outlook from inside. As a spokesperson of this basin, and I can talk about the vulnerability of the groups that are based there. It is a relationship with its inhabitants, with the basin, but also to say that the inhabitants, in the vast majority, by the social and education and economic bias in these basins, excepting by the Bravo and Zitácuaro, it is a situation that it's quite breakable when we are talking about them with this overview. From having access to water, the difficulties, the change of the use of soil, deforestation, and there are efforts and initiatives from the inhabitants that several times they are not heard. Here we can talk about how they can integrate it in the part of the state of Michoacán, Iztapa del Oro, Villa Victoria, Chiles do Clorines in the state of Mexico, and in the 7 dams. 3 of them are storage in the woods in Michoacán, Valle Bravo, and Villa Victoria in the state of Mexico, and derivatives that are Tuxpan, Iztapa del Oro, Riesgo, and Colorines. Difficulties in the subbasins. Here comes the interesting part and the significant part. I won't go into detail, but in the state of Mexico, the more marginal region and that just a few turn their look to it and to provide support. It's municipalities like Ixtapan del Oro, that from 125 municipalities being part of the state of Mexico, it's the poorest one, and it's the one with the highest level of education bias, with a 37%. And it's a subbasin, consequently rural, with a very spread population, and its economy is based in agriculture and livestock. These two aspects are well punished by the analysts. The industries present for Michoacán in Zitácuaro. The difficulties, among others, we talk about erosion, the change of the use of soil. And in this photograph, I just want you to take a look how the use of soil has changed from forest to livestock and to farming. And in places like Valle Bravo, it goes straight to deforestation, to urban usage, with the argument of that it's for field use. It's one of the municipalities where it doesn't even have knowledge if this change of soil it's legal or illegal. And here we're talking about indigenous groups. I think it's the more marginalized group in the basins because they have allowed it themselves. There are laws that protect them, but they don't know how to use them. I say this because these groups at the end, they live in a marginalization that it's complete. They don't live within a reality that we are having right now. They have allowed that their usages and the cosmovision and the traditions from indigenous peoples can be used for political aims and for touristic objectives even. Culture is sold. Indigenous culture is not taken care. It doesn't have that cosmovision, that ancestral respect that it has had for these indigenous groups, and that without a doubt, they are the ones who keep intrinsically the balance of the ecosystem resources that are required for the subbasins and its representation. If we talk about vulnerable groups, the representation that it exists on these subbasins is not representing us. It represents a minority. The large minority, as we know it, we are not represented by this minority, given that they have resources and they are not concerned for eating. In the case of the rest of the population, by the data that I just provided to you, you can see clearly that the rest of the group of the subbasins in the Guatemala system do not have a representation because they are more concerned for eating, for surviving, for by the extreme poverty that they are living. And this is well marked during the last years by the presence of criminal groups, which I'll not go into deep for that. And gender discrimination, as Guadalupe was mentioning, it is a very complicated situation because we have a migration here that in its majority in the population on the male gender in reproductive age, and from 15 years old they go and look for surviving in Toluca and Mexico City. Sometimes they go to United States. So who stays unprotected? The women, because she's the one that has to take the water. She has to see how they can have this surveillance, is surviving for their children, because they become mothers at a very young age. There's a location in Villa de Allende where the young girls from 13 years old are mothers, even younger. So it's a very complicated reality. At the end of the day, despite that they are the ones who need water, this discrimination is completely marginalized given that the decision makers are men. And why are we more underserved? I mean, not in my case, but in the best ones, where they have to wait for the husband, that the water committee, that it's not regulated, not recognized, and there are no state laws, neither national laws, neither local laws, not even in the municipalities. They are based on their usages and traditions, and they have power on that. Where what the president says is the last word, and there we have marginalization to women. So they are vulnerable groups, and it's a very cruel reality in these subbasins, except Valle de Bravo, and not in totality, not Valle de Bravo completely, just the golden area, as sometimes the people that live there call it, the jewel in the crown, because any ONG there, because there are 2 or 3 or 4 that have the resources, and Valle de Bravo turns their heads to it, and they provide it to Valle de Bravo. But what about the rest? And they are a minority. They move even for their own personal interests. But what about the rest that are a majority who turn their heads to us? There are isolated groups from municipalities like Villa de Allende, in Lagunas del Carmen, where they are doing whatever they need, that are natural water bodies and that are organizing themselves, because these water bodies have plagues, tules and lyriums, and that this year specifically, these water bodies are dried. We are foreseeing a very discouraging outlook. These are the marginalized groups. These are the vulnerable groups that live in the sub-basins. That's why in the morning that I was listening to Mario Lopez, this analysis that he was doing was not made from the Guatemala system, was made from their inhabitants, from the voices, from the necessity, from marginalization. That is what we are experiencing. That's why these spaces are so important for listening, but it's also important to take the situation and how can we organize ourselves, how the population organize. I mean, I mentioned an example. There are very important examples. That is in order to attend these necessities that have an organism. In a case of a ONG that works in these subbasins, and the most important one that can be an example, not only local but state or even national, is the municipality of Amanalco de Becerro, who has obtained a very efficient management in their forest resources, so much that today their water crisis is less. They could progress by this reason in social and education bias. They step up. but Ixtapan del Oro, Villa Victoria, amazingly, and why not Villa de Allende? We have in the subbasins of the Cutzamala system the more marginalized of the state of Mexico. That's what I can tell you. If we talk about vulnerable groups and about marginalization, they are in the subbasin of the Cutzamala system. And data won't lie. I mean, we can download them from Conoval. The data is there, and if we're experiencing it, I mean, we can even see that that is the reality.
Thank you, Mayra, for your presentation and also for giving a reality to the impact. Because sometimes we talk about the impact of climate change without remembering that it's the people and the most marginal people. Historically, those that are more vulnerable, they suffer more these consequences of a poor management of the water resources that is combined with this affectation that we see on a climatic level. So finally, I'm going to go to the last panelist, Rogel del Rosal. He is an advisor from the Indigenous or the vulnerable group coordinator of the Huasteca region in the Pánuco River. So he's also a promoter of the controllership of the water in San Luis Potosí and an advocate of the rights of indigenous peoples for free autonomy in the Huasteca Potosina. Thank you, Rogel, for being here virtually, so we hear you. Good afternoon. I live in Villitla municipality. As a general context, I say that La Huasteca Potosina is the 8th part of the basin of El Pánuco. It occupies 20 municipalities, 150,000 inhabitants. 65% of the inhabitants are indigenous, Nahuatl, and Chiwi. And that's the general context. The main factors of threat to water in the region are for sugar companies starting in the 60s. Sugarcane production has increased 5 times. So in consequence, we have lost forests. We have raw material for these. In the 80s, there was also a citric company that absorbs the production of 20,000 hectares of orange. In consequence, there's a lot of water used for these industrial operations in the year 2000. By the beginning of the century, there were some agro industries that produce 162,000 tons a year of meat for exportation, and at the same time 2 thermoelectrical companies in the northern part of La Huasteca in Tamuín to sell electric energy to the commission and to supply with energy to Cemex. And at the same time, the thermoelectrical company before Iberdrola was installed in the southern municipality of La Huasteca called Tamazmuchale, which is the greatest producer of energy in Latin America. Those are the 4 factors that have implied a high volume of water use in the region and also of pollution. So we see this threat in front of us of these 2 large projects, all the death projects, which are fracking, that covers an exploration and exploitation area of 372,000 hectares covering 18 municipalities of the region. And lately, this is not in operation yet. Fracking was stopped with Andrés Manuel López Obrador in the government, but it's still part of the agenda of the hydrocarbon companies to be implanted in the region. And the other problem or threat is the transfer of the water to the north of the country, to the states of Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, and even to Texas, 15 cubic meters per second, so per country. So that means 45 to bring water to the north, which would mean a great ecosystemic devastation. And among all the projects in operation, all of these threats that have not started yet, this would imply social and environmental disaster of great proportion in this part of the Pánuco Basin. Although there are other mega projects in operation, like this sugarcane project that also require water from the Moctezuma River, and also in the Pánuco municipality, the company Pantaleon that uses large volumes of water from this river. So basically, these are the large factors of threat for the region. So what we are coming up with are several things. First, the need of a new general law for water, the one in operation now, that started in 1992. It has opened doors for pollution and overexploitation. Also, we came up with the need of promoting the autonomous controllerships of water, and also a decisive participation of indigenous people affected by pollution, young people, organisms of civil society, and universities that want to monitor the policy on the different levels of government, as well as the operations of everyone related to water use, and also to carry out research with scientific support and to work on the different levels of the Mexican state to have fluid communication in order to solve these problems with the water. This is an initiative that we are promoting in the region, and we know that other regions are developing and considering all of this as well, because there's no really an authority on water. The commission only has 85 inspectors to review and surveil all the concessions, and 70% of them is covered by 7%. And they have no legal recognition or financing, and they are operating in order to guarantee human resources and human rights to water. Thank you, Rogel. Being aware of time and this long day that we are experiencing, I will make a quick question for each one of our panelists. I'm gonna start with Rogel. Rogel, thank you very much for your extensive, detailed timeline about all the vulnerabilities. But if you had to name what are the social groups that have been most affected by this situation in the basin, what would that be? Indigenous peoples by the deforestation in order to produce raw material and also the scarcity of water. If you have seen the news, the Valles River is dry, also the Salto River and the cascades of Tamul in these times of drought because they are in order to maintain irrigation. Also, urban groups of popular neighborhoods that are not having the infrastructure necessary to store water. And we could see that also women suffer the most the scarcity of water. And in the case of your basin, Guadalupe, you already named them in your presentation, but thinking about the specific impact of this scarcity on certain groups that might be more vulnerable. No, sorry, I meant Mayra. Sorry. I would say the same thing that Rogel said, the indigenous sector, because they have allowed it. If I allow the government and the people from society to limit me, then it will keep on happening. But as indigenous peoples, what I said, this delay in the education has a lot to do with the fact that they are still marginal. But also women, young kids that are in the basins because they have to help their families to get their resource to their homes. So I would say women, original peoples, young kids. Okay, and now Guadalupe. What was the question? Same question. What do you identify to be the most vulnerable groups and what's the impact on the everyday life of those groups? This water scarcity or the poor management and governance of these resources. Well, initially, I would say women, because women are in charge of water management and the spaces for expressing their ideas are not supported by institutions. So there's a risk that exercising that right to express themselves, they might suffer from physical violence or sexual or emotional violence because sometimes they are pointed and affected by the media. So children, young girls, because as my colleague said, they are the ones at home in rural areas. They have to go to the water source to bring it to their homes, to use it for their daily activities, for preparing food, for hygiene reasons. So the states need to take a look at these needs, and these water sources should be more accessible and to have an inclusion perspective towards these vulnerable groups. I also want to mention the groups with lower economical level. On the urban area, water should be provided by a network. However, this is just an ideal that it's not being achieved. This lack of water, then we see the tanks, water tanks, delivering water, and in urban communities, they have a really high price. And oftentimes we have seen in the field that women, that people should decide to eat or drink water, because these tanks sometimes the price is like 2,500 pesos or even 500 pesos a small container. So it's really sad to see. So I guess these three groups are the most affected ones, and how this vulnerability to this human right also touches other rights that are important, like the right to health, to life, education, food. It's a basic right. And I take this last reflection on the right of education because not only in these conversations we forget about that impact on the vulnerable groups, but also not long ago there was a study how access to water, well, the lack of access to water has an impact on the right of education on the young girls. Something as basic as having access to water in the school's toilets, and that has an impact on teenage girls mainly. So trying to focus more on governance, and when we are trying to speak about this multidimensional governance, interinstitutional, inclusive governance, what do you think are the greatest obstacles that different stakeholders are facing, especially those marginal and vulnerable in the participation on this governance? So I start with Guadalupe because you mentioned the difficulty that women have, and also men leaders in participating in governance on the basin. So what are those obstacles that you see? Well, as I said, that institutions need to be interrelated. First, for the management of the women that are participating for the defense of water and for water charge, there should be co-participation, and the state needs to generate that mechanism through which they can get closer to society with all of that necessary information to access, in this specific case, to this human right to access to water. Also needs to provide the necessary information to execute it in the best possible way, because how can we defend something that we don't know? So, as my colleague said, there are institutions, there are marginal populations that do not have awareness of this. So the state needs to generate those necessary mechanisms to bring that information closer to them. That on one hand. And when it comes to the technical situation, in the state of Mexico, it's executed by CAEM. It is super important that this water supply, I mean wells and perhaps another way, it should all be accessible to the population. For example, if the trip from the home to this place where they need to obtain it, if it's 1 kilometer, then that kilometer should have the necessary conditions. So, I mean, women need to be dealing with this situation of getting the water from this faraway place. So at least try to make it easier for them with enough lighting, with, I mean, making it more accessible for them. When it comes to health, food preparation, we see that sometimes water bodies are polluted, overexploited. Even if it smells acceptably, or if it tastes just fine, water sometimes it's polluted, and we prepare our food with that. And as I said, we see other rights being affected, like the right to health. We see that there's a lot of cancer as a consequence of polluted water. So it's very important that the state sets actions and mechanisms to guarantee that there's enough water, that it's accessible, affordable, and that it has the necessary quality to guarantee a good life for Mexicans. Thank you, Guadalupe. Mayra, in your identification of the vulnerable groups and marginal groups in the basin, what are the obstacles that you think you need to face in order to have a more participative and inclusive governance? Well, first of all, there's no governance. Then there are no spaces, or these spaces have been limited. A clear example, like 4 or 5 years ago, the Villa Victoria San José del Rincón Basin would session right at the basin. That power was centralized in Valle de Bravo. I'm not against Valle de Bravo. I just want to be clear about it. But I mean, that's the crown jewel of the state of Mexico. And I say this because I'm also in the educational sector, and all the resources on the state level, they give priority to Valle de Bravo. So there are two sides, the community sector and the educational sector. So power is being centralized in Valle de Bravos, and the people from the basin that has the interest in participating, their freedom is not there because they are more concerned about eating than covering the needs of the basin. So participation is reduced. Only those that have some means to transport ourselves, and sometimes we get support from other people. So these allow us to be in this type of spaces. So that's basically it. There is no way of being listened. And that's the importance of revalorizing the functions of these commissions on basins, because they were doing a really good job allowing the members of the basin to organize themselves, and specifically for the inhabitants, because many of the programs are focused on Cutzamala, and people were not even looking at them because they are not interested, because they are not receiving any benefit. But when a NGO gets to participate in a community, there's diagnosis in order to have real results, not misguided. So this part of governance is really important, and it's non-existent. Only a few years ago, we started thinking about it, and I said before, an NGO participating in Amanalco that has had success because they have bet on governance. If we don't have governance, it doesn't work. We need to have a comprehensive management of the basin, and we have to give more value and place to these commissions so inhabitants can have these areas to be heard, because this information goes to different governmental institutions where many times there's a lack of information, and it becomes so like national security, and people like us, we have no access to them. I have been working actively these past years in the basin. There's a lot of information that it's difficult to obtain. We need to ask for favors to people we know so we can get this information. And that's where the job gets affected. And that's where we have to do a lot of things and at least give some data so we can think about programs. So governance, it's important and it's to be implemented. Thank you, Mayra, for that. And finally, Rogel. You also see clear obstacles in terms of access to information, to be heard, as Mayra said, so voices can be heard for the most vulnerable people. What's the situation from the place where you are? There is a need of spaces for participation and also for building water policies in all levels. We could say that we need to figure out the legal framework on a national level to operate from top to bottom, and the institutional framework. Conagua, I mean, we need an institutional participation and also social participation, as well as resources. We look at the different offices from Conagua, empty with no operation, very specific programs for pollution, for discharge, but there's no authority intervening. Also, we need water policies, elaborating plans per basin, management of water, and also regulation from the micro basins, because they need to ensure the participation of the communities, all the stakeholders in the micro basins, and to have regulations that can operate from the bottom. Thank you very much to the three of you for these reflections. And before we close this panel, the work that we have been doing in the dialogue project with the EU and Mexico in this framework of subnational policy, we have incorporated a gender perspective, social inclusion in each step that we have taken. And I think that at least from this project, we have made clear that the commitment from now on needs to include women as well as other vulnerable groups, especially indigenous communities and regional peoples. And I think it is essential because what we are trying to achieve till the end of this project is to get the attention on the different strategies that will allow us to take these voices of these vulnerable groups in each one of the basins to those people that need to hear it. And that's what has moved us, not only to include this in this panel, but in this social inclusion and gender inclusion as part of these projects. Thank you once again for being here, and also for those that are online. And I hope we have a really that you have a really good session there at the hotel. Thank you, Tere. Thank you, Rogel, Mayra, Guadalupe.